That's probably not a good idea anyway, because if you don't see what, what I'm talking about, it's pretty hard to follow, I would imagine.
Could you like put a link to it on the Moodle page?
Yeah. Yep. You're talking about the video?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, well, let me say if you have any acquaintances that you hate or somebody you want to break up with, there's still time to add this class, so we've got a lot of openings. Maybe you could have them send me an email and I'll send a petition number. Get even with them. Well, I'm going to wait another minute for that person. Any questions? Comments? Here we go. Ready to roll? Go. Yeah.
We're good. Yep.
Okay, so this is really your last testable skill. I'm not sure if we practiced this last week or not, but aside from starting with a mood and figure, then showing the structure, right? Doing a Venn diagram proof of validity, identifying formal fallacies. We also want to be able to take arguments that are more or less written in English, translate them to standard form, then we identify the mood and figure, then the diagram, then formal fallacies. Your author gives you a procedure for this on page 209, I believe. I think it's we can even shorten the procedure a little bit. But again, it's a real simple set of instructions. And you'll just be following them every single time. See what page this is on. This is 235.
No, 34.
Okay, step one. We're looking at number 2 right here. Step 1, you have to find the conclusion of the argument. Now, oftentimes that'll be indicated by a conclusion indicator word, like therefore, thus, hence, ergo, consequently, as a result, in conclusion. And when that conclusion indicator is there, then that's no problem. But there's no rule that says an author has to use a conclusion indicator. And when there is none, you're supposed to be able to recognize a conclusion. It's a reading comprehension skill. Some of you might struggle with that, but there still are some tricks we can use to find it. But in number 2 here, that word so is a conclusion indicator. So this second proposition, all inventors are eccentrics, that's the conclusion of our argument. Now, you're going to translate that subject and predicate class with S and P. No thinking about that. And in these easy examples, it's very simple to identify what proposition the English translates to, A, E, I, or O. So, all inventors are eccentrics. That's an A proposition. We're using S and P for the subject and the predicate. Go ahead and write that on your notebook, where it's going to end up on the bottom of our 3 propositions. All S is P. Next step, we want to identify the major premise of the argument. The major premise, by definition, is the one that contains the predicate of the conclusion, the major term. or its class, actually. So, that major term class is eccentrics. We're looking for the premise that makes reference to eccentrics. That's the major premise. And we see it's this final proposition. There's eccentrics right there. So we can multitask here a little bit. The first thing that I would do is I would note that the major term, eccentrics, is in the subject position of that premise, right? So let's go ahead and put P in the subject position of that premise of our translation. Now that premise also has to contain the middle term M, and there's only one place for it to go. So let's take care of that. Then you just finish it off by recognizing what sort of proposition that translates into, A, E, I, or O. All eccentrics are. So you fill in your quantifier and copula. All is. Now that remaining premise, it is the minor premise, but that's kind of cheating. It's not the minor premise because it's left over. It's the minor premise because it contains the minor term. That's the subject of the conclusion. So let's check that out. Subject of our conclusion is inventors. There's that same class in the remaining proposition, the first one of the argument. So the first thing I would do is put my S in the subject position of that premise. That premise has to contain the middle term M, and there's only one place for it to go. Right there. Then you just finish off the translation by identifying, well, what sort of proposition does that translate or reduce to? It's another A proposition, right? So fill in your quantifier and copula. So now what we want to do is identify the mood and figure of this argument form. That's an AAA2, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, we did this, I think, twice tonight. We know it's invalid and we know why. It's illicit minor term. I'm sorry, undistributed middle term. So we're not going to diagram this right now. We'll move on to the next one. Question?
What's up with the numbers at the end?
Numbers.
You know, when you put AA and then -2.
Ooh. That's called figure. It tells us where the middle term is. There's a chart in your book. There are 4 possible arrangements of the middle term. That's critical. Yeah, you've got to acquire that. So let's not diagram that. We already did it tonight. Move on to the next one. Step 1, identify the conclusion. Let's see, do we have a conclusion indicator? We sure do, therefore.
Ta-da.
The subject and predicate of that proposition are going to be translated with S and P. It's the conclusion. There's no thinking to be done about that. So all you have to do is recognize the correct translation, A, E, I, or O. Some are not. Is that an A, E, I, or O translation?
Oh.
It's an O proposition. So you simply write out some S is not P in the conclusion position of your translation. Second, identify the major premise of the argument. By definition, it's the one that contains the major term, or the predicate of the conclusion, whose class is reptiles. So in other words, we're looking for the premise that makes reference to reptiles.
Snakes are
There it is right there. It's the second proposition of the argument. So P is going to be in the predicate position of this translation. P for the major term always, right? So let's go ahead and put our P in the predicate position. This is going to have to be M in the subject. And it's an A proposition. All M is P. Don't forget to write the major premise on top of your translation. We have to order it correctly. That's major premise, minor premise, conclusion. Okay, that remaining premise is the minor premise, but let's make sure that it contains the minor term of the argument, which is the subject of the conclusion, or in other words, dangerous animal. There it is right there. It's in the first proposition of the argument. Let's note that that class, or the minor term S, it's in the predicate position of that premise. So our S is going to be in the predicate position. M is snakes, that's going to be the subject. Then simply recognize the letter name translation, A, E, I, or O, and finish it off. What is it? O. So it's going to be some M is not S. Good? Okay, now that we have it translated, we can identify the mood and figure, which you're going to have to do. A, O, O, 3. Go ahead and do a Venn diagram proof of its validity or invalidity. We find it to be invalid, we'll check for fallacies. Not going to do that. Does it matter which premise we diagram first?
Yes.
Yes. Why?
Because they're universal.
Universal quantifier.
One of them is universal and the other is particular. So which one must we diagram first? The universal. All MSP. Then take care of the particular premise. I trust you have 4 and 7 crosshatched. Minor premise. See, that doesn't go in a line. You don't have a choice of two segments in which to put that x. It's got to go in M, but not S. Well, we can do that. Segment 6. So, do you interpret this as the diagram of a valid or an invalid argument form?
Invalid.
Some S is not P. Does our diagram indicate that? No. Two conditions would have to be met for the truth of that conclusion to be indicated. There would have to be an X in S, because the conclusion says there is. There's no X in circle S, period. So we have to go no further. It's invalid. Let's check for fallacies. Here's a good way to learn the fallacies real quickly. Check them in the order in which we learned them. Just go through them. After a couple times, be no problem. So we want to check for a distributed middle term.
Yes.
M is the subject of an O proposition here in the minor premise. Is that distributed or no?
No.
It's not. But it only has to be distributed once, so let's check here.
Yes, it is.
It's the subject of an A proposition, and that's distributed, right? Okay. Doesn't commit that fallacy. Let's check the major and minor terms. Is our predicate of our conclusion, it's the predicate of an O proposition, is that distributed? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes, it is. So it better be distributed in the major premise.
It's not.
There it's the predicate of an A proposition. Distributed or no? No. So there's at least that fallacy. Illicit major term. Let's keep going. It might commit more than one fallacy. Is our minor term distributed in the conclusion? It's the subject of an O. Is that distributed?
No.
No. So it doesn't have to be distributed in the minor premise. The rule clearly states if a term is distributed in the conclusion, then, etc. Okay, one fallacy so far. Exclusive premises. Do both of our premises have negative quality? No. Major premise is affirmative. Drawing an affirmative conclusion from one negative premise. Do we even have an affirmative conclusion?
No.
No. One more. Existential fallacy. Do we have both premises having universal quantity?
No.
What? No. Done. One fallacy. Next one. Okay. We have no conclusion indicator here. We do have a premise indicator.